Dr. Biswas did his doctoral work on the sclerosis of Albert Winter and has been a Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow, University of East Anglia, UK. His primary area of interest are modern theatre, popular culture, and translation studies. He has written and edited several books, amongst which Theatre Theory and Performance, and the edited volume Looking for Home, Journey and Boundary in Postmodern Texts may be mentioned. Dr. Biswas has presented papers in many parts of the world and has a number of scholarly articles to his name. Apart from academics, his other passion is travel photography. Well, this is what his bio note presents him. But beyond and besides this bio note, we know Dr. Biswas as a wonderful human being who believes in following professional ethics and honoring his commitments, whatever may it take. There's a lot we can learn from him on personal and professional front. With huge respect, I invite you to take up this virtual platform, Dr. Siddharth, for your lecture on Renaissance prose.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Uh, it's actually a privilege to be able to be a part of this wonderful program that you are organizing, and my thanks to Korean City College Jamshedpur for letting me be a part of this. So indeed, in these troubled times, as much uh, as we can, our engagement in these academic affairs are very, very necessary, I think, to continue with our intellectual activities. So it's a wonderful program that you are conducting. My thanks to Professor Ibrahim, and I'm sure I will become good friends with the other members of the department and the college. So I am looking forward to that, and I am looking forward to meeting you all personally at some point of time, not like this, but until then, I mean, this has to do. So I will start, I will just switch my video off here and I will start my presentation. And then after, I might take a few breaks for a couple of minutes or so in between, because my doctor is still not very confident that I can do this, although I have assured him that there is no problem here. So I will just start presenting and then I'll start speaking. I hope the PowerPoint is visible.
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Okay. Okay. Then I'll just start. Uh, Elizabethan prose, like all other literary forms, is a combination of three factors: traditions that seeped through from Old English and Middle English times, influences from mainland Europe, and demands of the reading public coupled with new publishing technology. As we know, Old English prose was mostly of native origin and has its roots in Christianization of England. Although it began with Latin, but there was a handsome amount of translations and a considerable corpus of original prose works. Who can forget King Alfred's translation of Cura Pastoralis, which becomes the Shepherd Hook in Old English? It's called here. I'm sorry, I cannot really pronounce that. Not very good in Old English. Or for that matter, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is including a lot of such instances. Middle English prose was not sparse, though it pales in comparison with the verse romances. However, we have religious prose such as Walter Hilton's The Scale of Perfection. We have Bible translations, and of course, non-religious works such as the Voyage and Travels of Sir John Mandeville. and of course Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. The Fanciful Mandeville's Travels was a translation from French. The English version is dated somewhere around 1375. Even the Canterbury Tales has the person's tale, which shows the prosaic nature of the person. So that is a comment on prose, but still prose is seeping through. Even though Chaucer's prose tale is a comment, as I said, on the concerned narrator, with perhaps a light comment on the unexciting nature of the prose medium, prose still managed to shrug off the aura of dull seriousness and make inroads into the realm of entertainment. By the time Queen Elizabeth is crowned, prose has branched into several forms and genres. Along with tales, we have the histories and lives. The latter two are supposed to be factual but often venture into the fantastical. Then there are treatises, pamphlets, tracts, which sometimes merge into one another. And of course, there are the essays, which bloom mostly during the late Elizabethan and Jacobean periods. However, it is prose fiction that becomes the most major addition to the body of English literature. According to some, even with these varieties and variations, the form of prose remains similar and has this unique Elizabethan flavor. If we are to take a closer look at the development of prose in this period, we would find some valuable socio-cultural insights into the time. With the ascension of Elizabeth into the throne and the historical marine victories, England was becoming aware of its own Englishness. The newfound pride in this national identity impacted all layers of life. People of England were, for the first time, coming out of the hybridity that history had imposed upon them. They were no longer carrying the Viking Norman mixed inheritance, but were purely English. And English with a pride that current geopolitical situation has allowed them to have. The defeat of the so-called invincible Spanish Armada in 1588 ensured England's position as the super colonial power. This was reflected in everyday life and in the formation of the national consciousness. This produced greater focus on the English language and was instrumental in replacing Latin as the language of prestige. The disassociation with Rome during Henry VIII's reign was also an important factor. By this time, the process of Bible translations had found settlement, and vernacular prose was familiar to the popular perception. Prose, therefore, had greater scope in the artistic arena, having equal space in theatre as well. The prose dialogues were quite as many as the verse dialogues by this time. And of course, theatre, I'm not really talking about theatre here. So this opened up the possibilities for independent prose works beyond its earlier, mostly humdrum instructional identity. Another socio-economic factor that contributed to the rise of prose was the slow disappearance of the minstrels. With more lucrative work to be found, the minstrels were becoming an endangered species. The printing presses were no help to them. With Latin now replaced by English, people were demanding more books in their own tongue, and along with poems and sonnet sequences, some prose works, theatre, and fiction became extremely popular. It was not only the court or the common people that influenced this growth, it was the highly self-conscious, newly emergent middle class that became the primary consumer of prose works along with the other established forms. The translations not only allowed the reading public to get a taste of representation in prose, but also allowed the authors to experience new ways of storytelling. Castiglione and his Il Libro del Cortegiano, which we know as the Book of the Courtier, Antonio de Guevara's The Dial of Princess, like Machiavelli's The Prince, Jorge de Momier's 7 Books of the Diana, among others, had a great impact on contemporary authors and readers. One must mention Thomas North's translation of Relux de Principes and Sir Thomas Hoby's translation of Il Libro del Cortegiano. The moral tracts and treatises and pamphlets and the courtesy books that came toward the beginning of the age had a firm grasp on the narrative art. It began with the aim of courtly and gentlemanly education, but elements of fiction soon appeared. The early sugar-coated moral instructions evolved into narratives that combined lessons with different forms of entertainment and with different forms of expression. There were many such at the time, but one may mention a few like the baby's book, the Book of Nurture, Eliot's The Book of the Governor, the Schoolmaster, and Sir Humphrey Gilbert's Queen Elizabeth's Academy. And you can see the cover of the baby's book and the decorations and etc. It was quite wonderful how they managed to get all those illustrations into the print editions. That must have been very difficult with the block printing and everything, but anyway. So we have this on one hand. On the other hand, we have authors such as Robert Greene and Thomas Lodge, who wrote prose romances. On the other, we have works with high literary aims, such as Philip Sidney's The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, which we call Arcadia, and his The Defense of Poesy, also known as an apology for poetry. In Sidney's and some works of other contemporaries like Greene and Lodge, we see the continuation of the earlier Romance tradition, sometimes mingled with the Renaissance idea of the pastoral. Now, what I am not going to do in this discussion is that I am not going to talk about Arcadia, because Arcadia is far too common, and in this particular space I have some other texts to mention, at least, if not discuss. So, that with that apology, let me continue. I was speaking about the pastoral. Even though the pastoral form was quite popular in European literature, in England it was so adapted that it found itself firmly in the English rural scene. However, it is not the development of the pastoral that is of primary significance when we speak of Elizabethan prose. Quite interestingly, prose soon found itself looking at the lives of ordinary people. Lives of ordinary people and engaging with the realities of urban and rural lives. Authors such as Greene, Nash, and Thomas Trelawney were not only aiming to amuse, but they were also conscious of a social duty. Perhaps they were trying to reform, but they most definitely were trying to comment on the prevailing conditions. Once again, this was not new, but rather in the tradition of Havelock the Dane and Piers the Plowman. We know how in these two texts the ordinary is celebrated, and how, of course, celebrated and somewhat allegorically presented. It's not a complete celebration of ordinary life, but the ordinary is taken as symbolic, it is taken as allegorical, etc. And but this tradition of looking at the third estate, the farmers, the peasants, that is not entirely absent, even though it is there in a very different kind of garb, in a different kind of form. And so from this, what we have, uh, prose is soon turning into something immediate and directly involved with the English life of all categories, all classes, all echelons. So that is important. Now, what I'll do is I will talk about a few of the major prose writers, and there are certain specific items of interest here that I will try to talk about. Let me just move on to the next slide. Uh, See, Green is someone who, I mean, for me, the primary interest with Green is the autobiographical element that he is engaging in. Right? He is, I mean, in an age which is still not far away from the belief that literary work should remain anonymous as they are in service of God. We have an author who is revealing openly that his works are autobiographical. Not only veiled, I mean, of course, there are autobiographical elements in many texts that you could find, but unlike presentations of history in the Old English period, the English texts of the Old English period, like the Battle of Maldon or the Battle of Brunanbar, where other great personages are celebrated or religious personages are celebrated, what we have here is a look at the self. And this is something that I find fascinating, because in Chaucer we have that. In Chaucer we have that in a very humorous and often symbolic manner. But Chaucer, of course, is enamored with life, and he is not only looking at, he is looking at other people, he is looking at himself as well. But of course he couldn't finish, so anyway, let me not waste time over there. So we have someone who is openly autobiographical. Green, in his mourning garment and never too late, presents his own life in a casually masked manner. He would soon deal with life in London, but in these two texts, the focus is on the life of the individual. The former text adapts the biblical story of the prodigal son, and the latter presents this person called Francesco, who is essentially Green himself. In Never Too Late, we see the protagonist persona's marriages, abandonment, the dire consequences he has to face, and how some actors help him. So these are interesting snapshots into contemporary life, but these are also very interesting looks at the life of the author himself. So this is something which is, well, I personally find it very interesting. It's not that other people would find it so, but I do. But when we come to the more famous work that he has, the Groatsworth of Wit, bought with a million of repentance, which is probably composed on his deathbed, Green is saying quite directly that Roberto, the persona, is himself. This is something that he is clearly presenting, clearly admitting. But if we go to his other works, mainly pamphlets, we find London featuring more directly, more prominently. And this obsession with London is there in a lot of texts at that time, not particularly in theatre, in the histories of Shakespeare and the other historical plays perhaps, but not in all other texts. London would become the darling in later, slightly a few decades later, when we have the neoclassical people writing, and Pope, his love with London is seen in his texts. But we have not the love of London per se here, and you need to remember that this is the time when the city of London is developing. The city of London is becoming, in a way, the center of the known universe, the center of the Eurocentric universe, as the Eurocentric histories tell us. So the look at London here is not a loving look at London, but a look which is rather critical, which is kind of telling people that London is not a particularly good place to be. I mean, they are probably thinking that London is becoming the center of a lot of criminal activity, which it was becoming, because what we tend to forget, that all these seafaring adventures, all the glorious stories of Sir Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh that we hear, they were essentially pirates. They were licensed pirates, and they were murderers and thieves and etc. And they were plundering whatever land they could land on. And so, even if these were gentlemen, people like Raleigh and Drake, the sailors were not. And these sailors were there in London, and they were basically quite often not people you would want to know. They were mostly cutthroats and not the glorious people that are celebrated in a lot of literature. Something like, not even loving rogues like Jack Sparrow and all that, if you are to believe in popular culture. But London features here more directly this critical thing, and Green targets the so-called low life of London along with honest tradesmen trying to make a living. His notable discovery of Kusnaj is a warning to all regarding how London can swindle and trap the innocent. And this is a typical urban story that we hear. There are so many stories, even about cities like Delhi, like cities like Kolkata, that you come here and there are a lot of cheating. And we know it's quite true. I mean, if you are not familiar, if you are not quite adept at how to deal with the city, then you will get conned. I have been swindled in Delhi. So, and people have tried to do so in Kolkata, and I have told them that don't even try. But anyway, so this trapping the innocent, these traps are not necessarily only this kind of swindling and conning, but there are other attractions which the city has, which can ensnare somebody, which can destroy somebody. And Green is quite critical of that, and we are talking about a time which is 5 centuries back. We tend to glorify our country when it was, in the 1500s, although I have very little idea how, we have very little idea how it was actually. We hear of golden ages and etc. in history books, but life on the ground may not have been as rosy as it is presented in history. And these pamphlets, they do tell us a lot about that time. They do tell us a lot about how life actually was, not the glorious London that is presented by Elizabethan history, not the courtly London, not even the theatrically exquisite London, but a very real, a very dirty and dingy kind of a representation that we have. And of course, London did not take kindly to this. Apparently, there was an attack on Green's life at that time, and there were a lot of counter pamphleteering that was happening. And of course, Green was not someone who would accept defeat. So he continued to write. He pamphlets like, a defense of conny catching, and a disputation between a he conny catcher and a she conny catcher. And these included, images, quite vivid, even lurid images of the prostitutes in London. It was commentary around the trade, and not only that particular trade, but the people who were engaging in the trade, the people who were visiting, the people who were customers, etc. So there was, Green is not allowing anyone to just not be criticized. So he was targeting everybody. And of course, Green did not limit himself to the sordidness that was found amongst the lower classes. He also focused on the apparently respectable people of the city, and how these respectable people were not quite respectable, and something that we also found during the we also find during the Victorian period much later. But anyway, he wrote quip for an upstart courtier, or a quaint dispute between velvet breeches and cloth breeches, to assess whether the courtiers or the tradesmen should command greater respect. And this is something quite wonderful, because even in the Renaissance, these pamphleteers, and I will talk about Delaunay later on, these pamphleteers, they are looking at the courtiers, they are looking at the upper classes, and they are challenging this idea that the upper classes are automatically better, that they are above and beyond any kind of criticism. And of course, Green was not quite favored because of all that. And he is demanding that the new trade classes have a lot to do in nation building. They have a very positive impact on life, on the economy definitely, and they should command a lot of respect. This is something that Green was trying to tell everyone. In the Black Book's Messenger, Green dabbles in a kind of biography by focusing on a famous scoundrel of the time named Ned Brown. And it's a curious look, because Ned Brown is quite a rogue of that town, and it's almost like the adventures of Ned Brown. And there are a lot of humor here. There are a lot of enjoyment, amusement in this. Although he is talking about someone who is a celebrated criminal, but he is presenting this in a humorous manner. Green also experiments with form here. He presents his tale in the mode of the medieval dream allegory. And you know how serious the medieval mode dream allegories were. I mean, we all have studied Pearl, Purity, Patience, Gawain, for that matter. There is a movie on Gawain which is coming quite soon. I am looking forward to it, although I am slightly apprehensive of what Hollywood would do to that, to the Gawain story. Gawain is a very favorite story of mine for some reason. So the Gawain is, of course, not, it's a metrical romance, but the dream allegories like Pearl and Purity and all those texts, there is a reference to that, and there is a comic reference to that. By applying that to the life of a rogue, it's becoming a very, it's almost a metatextual reference that we have. And although we should not get into all those theories when we are talking about the Renaissance prose. We would uh, it's one of the beginnings of such. Let us say that it's a kind of inheritance that we have now. His final pamphlet, The Repentance of Robert Greene, is quite clearly autobiographical. It's not his best work. It is also written on his deathbed. But here again, even in the title, we see this autobiographical element. This interest in autobiography sets Greene apart from other prose writers of the day. It is not that autobiography was unknown at the time. One can readily mention the book of Marjorie Kemp from the Middle English period, but the celebration of the authorial self is something one may link with the emerging idea of humanism. And along with that, the fact that the reality of ordinary life is considered significant enough to be included into the artist's gaze by one of the university wits within pamphlets which are not necessarily religious is significant both from the socio-cultural and literary points of view. Now, this entire idea of the Renaissance and of humanism, and what I am trying to do here is to look at how this idea is forming. After the formation, it's quite evident. We have Bacon, we have a lot of other texts which I will mention towards the end, but the development of these ideas, these people through these pamphlets and these other non-fiction elements, they open up the entire idea of a humanistic experience. And there are a lot of Latin texts which would come, which of course I do not want to talk about because I am limiting my discussion to English and how this English prose is developing and finally emerging into something, evolving into something else. And since we are talking about university wits, the other university wit who wrote about London and its grimy underbelly was Thomas Nashe. He was involved in the dramatic scene, but that did not turn out as happily as one would have wanted. In 1597, Nashe co-wrote a play called Isle of Dogs with Ben Jonson, and the authorities found it to be seditious as they imagined the Queen herself was the target of satire. Jonson was arrested. The incarceration did not last long, but Nashe managed to escape. However, Nashe's prose writings date before this unfortunate incident. I mention this quite deliberately. I open with this because Nashe's satirical tendencies are beginning with the prose works and developing into something that is actually getting him into trouble. And the other form, the other idea of the Renaissance that I would like to repeatedly emphasize on is that somehow or the other it is quite limited to literature. Because as you see, the moment there is one step that falls outside the boundary of what is allowed, there are arrests, there are dire consequences quite often. Even earlier Thomas More had to pay with his life, even though he was one of the most important thinkers of the day. And this is continuing. The moment something is suspected to be, well, anti-establishment, there are arrests, there are persecutions, and in those days persecution meant you lose your head. So life was not exactly very rosy at that time for anybody. Even though we celebrate the Renaissance, the the opening up of so many ideas and everything, life on the ground was as authoritarian as it was and as it, well, always is. So anyway, fortunately, Nash did manage to escape, as I said, and his prose writings do take us forward to that. Much on the lines of Green, Nash wrote his pamphlets representing the public life of London. Nash's style was full of wit, and he engaged in satire not quite as virulently as Dryden or Pope would a few decades later. And if you must remember, if you later on, Dryden and Pope's satire would be targeted against not the establishment per se, but the political ideologies and the political conflicts, and quite often at the cost of ordinary people. And here in these pamphlets and these prose pieces, we have a different kind of attitude that they are actually trying to, if not reform, they are actually trying to comment on contemporary life. The three major things that Nash seemed to hate were, vice in the guise of respectability, which of course which I think would survive as long as humanity survives. He hated social affectations, once again something that we have not cured, and the rampant superstition that ruled the times. And this is wonderful because here we have a new scientific mind, because these scientific ideas that were coming in from the continent and that were being discussed, doubted, challenged even in England, these ideas, this is very important because we tend to limit ourselves to literature, but we need to remember that this literature is not coming out in a vacuum. Literature is a part of a very large ideological background, that everything, each and everything that is happening all around, technological advances, scientific advances, the discussions that are taking part everywhere, people are taking part in all spheres of the of society, etc., which are coming to the people, they are a major part of the literary background, not only social but also the literary. And these superstitions, and we know the witchcraft, the witch hunting, these things that were going on, how people were focusing on dreams, how, I should not say that because we still have practically all those superstitions still. Nash is looking at the first, which is vice in the guise of respectability, in his book Anatomy of Absurdity. And the title is wonderful. I would not really dream that people would actually read these books. I'm quite sure most of them would seem rather uninteresting these days. Only for us researchers and the unfortunate students of literature, these books are sometimes interesting. But if you look at the Anatomy of Absurdity, the idea of absurdity that Nash is introducing, that these the idea of respectability and how people hide behind these ideas of respectability, how absurd that is. I'm not saying that the 20th century idea of the absurd is coming from this, not at all, but we have a glimpse of this absurd construct coming into literature quite early. Now he is looking at social affectations in Pierce Penniless, his supplication to the devil, and here he presents Pierce, who deals with politicians and religious people, among others, who wreak havoc on society. And the name Pierce would come back because of Pierce the Plowman. This name Pierce has this again intertextual relevance. The moment the name Pierce is presented to the contemporary audience, they would automatically think of Pierce Plowman, right? So Pierce the Penniless is a kind of a nod, a kind of a salute to Pierce the Plowman, even in its alliteration, And he, quite interestingly, talks about all those religious subsects that come up. Subsects. There are, I don't know, I think I read somewhere that there are about 3,000 sects of Christianity, at least. If you read the name of the rose, then you would see how many little sects, and in London there were hundreds of sects, if not less. I am not very sure if hundreds is right, but there were quite a few sects. People were saying this, and if you remember the Summoner and the Pardoner from Chaucer, they were all buying these forged ideas, these the bone of the saint, the cloth of the saint, and apparently they were religious relics which were sold. And there were a lot of religious gurus at that time who were preaching their versions of Christianity, and Nash is lashing out against them. Nash is saying that they are destroying the fabric of society. He's obviously, there is no possibility of him being an atheist, but he is looking at core religion, and he is speaking against these people who are corrupting religion. And Nash, of course, also had a early scuffle with the law. I mean, with Isle of Dogs, he would have a major issue, but when he wrote, when his Christ's Tears over Jerusalem was published, he also had a little scuffle, as I said, with the law. The satire on London morality was thought to be unparliamentary, and Nash was imprisoned for a brief while. So, as always, the authoritarian rule that I was talking about, that's very much there. And he dealt with the superstition part in Terrors of the Night, and he gives a skeptic's view of the supernatural interpretation of dreams and the existence of supernatural beings. In fact, it was so popular that Shakespeare borrowed from it for a dialogue by Theseus in Act 5, Scene 1 of A Midsummer Night's Dream. The dialogue being, it's a long dialogue, I am not going to read it. I don't know whether you can, if it's large enough on your screens or not, you can just take a quick look. I'll just take a 30-second break. Well, you can get this dialogue anywhere in your texts later on. So let me continue. And in fact, I will give you this PowerPoint presentation anyway. So you can take a look later. Let me just continue. What Nash does, even if you read this particular dialogue, you will see that this presents us with a more scientific and truly Renaissance look at the contemporary world. Nash focuses entirely on a witty representation of life in his later one, Lenten Stuff, which deals with the red herring, using the idiom to present how red herrings have been ultra significant in the history of the world, the red herring. So we all know what the red herring means. So that red herring thing is there. Now, Nash was amongst the first major writers to give us a novel-like prose fiction work titled The Unfortunate Traveler or the Life of Jack Wilton. Now, I say it novel-like because there are a lot of debates, because we know the rise of the novel is supposed to occur later on in the history of literature. The novel as we define it came later. So, but a lot of people accept The Unfortunate Traveler as a novel, and a lot of people say that this is where the early novels are actually beginning. In fact, there is a lot of research that is going on which are challenging the location of novels like Pamela or Clarissa to be the first ones, and they are saying that no, we can go back to the Elizabethan period, we can go back to the Renaissance, and we can look at these texts, and they are worthy of being called novels. Although I do not believe in such things, because literature is nobody's property, and we kind of have this habit of classifying everything, engaging in taxonomy. So anyway, it was one of the first picaresque works in English. The term picaresque came much later, of course, but the adventures of the Picaro figure were popular in Spain since the mid 16th century. The typical lovable rogue here is an English page. He has many adventures all around Europe and mingles with all classes of society. His travelling companion is the figure of Earl of Surrey, Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, we all know him. And they meet celebrated personalities such as Sir Thomas More, Erasmus, Martin Luther, and even magicians like Cornelius Agrippa. These are all familiar names here. So, and many such others. And of course, there are a lot of anachronisms here. Of course, he is not looking at any kind of history telling. And Nash, of course, includes a typical love story in which Jack Wilton must pursue the heroine Diamante. And the work follows much of the Spanish formula, but Nash presents Jack Wilton as a person who is in love with mischief and not really tainted by other kinds of roguery. I mean, he is not a particularly avaricious man or a person who is trying to harm others, but rather someone who is looking for mischief, who is delighting in mischief. Now, even though the history of the novel starts later, some consider the works of like The Unfortunate Traveler to be early instances. Now, since we are talking about novels, the next person that I am going to talk about, he is someone who is writing a lot of long prose fiction, and some people are calling his work novels. And the other writer who is, as I said, thought to have contributed to the birth of the English novel is Thomas Delany. Unlike the others, Delany was not concerned with the rogues and witty representations. His sole aim was to concentrate on the contemporary realistic space. Some people say that it was in his hand that the reality-oriented prose fiction of the age matured. See, reality-oriented prose fiction, not the pamphlets, not the texts that were satirizing contemporary life in a non-fictitious manner, but this is prose fiction which is imaginative, which is dealing with life in general, and which is also celebrating life in general, and which is finding ordinary life to be worthy of serious literature. This is something new. I mean, when we go to The Romantic period, we see the ordinary being celebrated. In the Neoclassical age, it's a very different kind of an aura that we have. You know, it's not until plays like She Stoops to Conquer that we have a kind of a bridge between the urban sophistication and the rustic world. And but in Delany, we have early instances of such a, I don't know whether to call it an experiment, because Delany is quite convinced in what he is doing. His convictions cannot be challenged. Now, Delany also was recognized as a balladeer, and it's quite fascinating that all these authors shared these fear of the authority and persecution from the authorities. He was a balladeer. His prose works have come into the limelight relatively recently. What sets Delany apart is how he sets to find out the romances of the ordinary prosaic life. Quite like Nash, Delany also fell into disfavor in 1596 when the authorities thought that one of his ballads he had presented to the Queen was lurid and indecent. Delany had to sacrifice his corpus of around 50 ballads that he had written in the last decade of his life and go into hiding. So once again, the authority strikes and the creative artist has to hide. The freedom of expression is curtailed. What else is new? So he goes into hiding, but fortunately things are settling quite soon. They are not really looking for him, and he comes back, and he after things are getting settled, Delany started to write prose. He created a formula which is strictly followed. He borrowed a historical or mythical incident and turning that into the background, looked into the lives of contemporary ordinary people. Each of his works looked at a specific craft and celebrated the craft. Delany did not bother much with accuracy of events, but allowed his imagination to take hold. For instance, the last of his books, Thomas of Reading, is set probably in the times of Henry I, and he talks about Henry I was the son of William the Conqueror. This is a time when, after the Battle of Hastings, England is settling down and it is starting to become the England of the Renaissance. So this is a very important time, and Delany looks at that time and sets his novel during that time. And the other thing that you all know, that in the medieval period the guilds had become very strong, the craft guilds, the tradesmen's guilds. And if you go to European cities, you will see all these almost fort-like structures which were sponsored by guilds. The city walls, parts of the city walls were often sponsored by the guilds. In Budapest, you see the Fisherman's Wharf. In some Romanian cities, you see such walls made by people like the tailors, the Guild of the Tailors, etc. And in London, it was more court-centric, because London at that time was very powerful, so it did not need to depend on the guilds, or it was so authoritarian that it did not feel the need to name these structures in the name of the guilds that had sponsored it. But anyway, coming back to the discussion, and Thomas of Reading is about clothiers and their brilliance. Delany's earlier novel, Jack of Newbury, was set during the times of Henry VIII, and we see the weaver, who is called John Winchcombe, interacting closely with the king and with Cardinal Wolsey. So two of the most significant figures in pre-Elizabethan history. And this novel not only carries Delany's humor, but also includes a rather subversive look at English history. His second book, The Gentle Craft, is a collection of tales about shoemakers. And this prose romance is often considered to be a source of Thomas Dekker's The Shoemaker's Holiday. Through his humorous representation of ordinary life, Delany manages to challenge the precept that only the aristocrats are important in society. His works celebrate the ordinary and establish the impact of the tradespeople on the remarkable events that shaped history. His works faced a lot of disapproval for his choice of such ordinary subjects for romance, instead of looking at them through satirical denigration, and his style did not escape harsh criticism. His prose, he is not accepted for a long time. Even the history of literature, even the canon, had not really accepted Delany as a major writer. And and of course, there is a lot to criticize at that point of time. His prose is far from perfect or consistent, and often vacillates from the romantic to the journalistic. Of course, the journalistic was not there, but journalism as we know it was not there, but his prose is often, flat. But any flaw one may find in him, one can find in the works of any pioneer who is working with a new formula, because he is essentially creating this. He is essentially creating a model for later writer. All these authors are. By the time we have the English proper prose, it becomes the proper English prose when we read Bacon. But all these people, they had a lot to contribute to what later would become the proper celebrated Queen's prose. Now, some others writers we must mention. It would be unfair if we do not mention them. I have selected 4. There are many others. Now, on the slide, you see Lodge's. It's a picture portraying the person called William Longbeard. He is William Fitz Osbert, and you see he is being arrested and he is being taken in a very Elizabethan manner. And of course, this is a kinder picture because they were very fond of hanging and quartering. And on the far end, if you can see the painting properly, you see the hooks which are dangling from the scaffold, and you can imagine what kind of punishment he is taken towards. And I mention this book in particular because Lodge is presenting a person who was known as the advocate of the poor, who was called William Longbeard because of his long beard. And this person had led a peasants' uprising in 1196. And imagine, we have Thomas Lodge, who is presenting the life of such a person. He is showing this person's death and punishment and everything. So that is all right, the life and death of William Longbeard. But he is selecting this person. So in some ways, it is wonderful that it might be a warning that Thomas Lodge is giving to the people, that you should not revolt, you should not create this kind of uprising. But still, the fact that such an uprising is mentioned is quite interesting. It's rare and it's interesting. And the presentation of the hero as a typical rogue which takes away the seriousness of the offense to a certain extent, is something that one can really discuss in a separate discussion. And there are other texts. I find this A Post with a Packet of Mad Letters. These are wonderfully humorous, and once again Piet's Plains 7 years apprenticeship. So the name Piet's comes back, etc. And the last one, John Dickinson's Green in Concept New, Raised from the Grave, is unique because Dickinson is imitating Green and speaking of a narrative continuity that is unique in contemporary fiction. He is speaking of Green, he is presenting himself as a kind of a follower of Green, kind of someone who is inheriting Green's style, etc. Now, although I have I have stayed in a zone which is early, which is not typically Renaissance, but I cannot really talk about this without talking about Francis Bacon. And Bacon, we can't really, any discussion of Renaissance prose, and it would be all about Francis Bacon, apart from the minor factors. And all the history that I have given you for the last hour or so almost, it has led to the development of this prose. It has brought us to Bacon. And Bacon is not in the Elizabethan period, but mostly Bacon's works fall in the Jacobean period, in the Renaissance no less. But and what we have here is, with Bacon we enter the realm of serious philosophical prose. And this philosophical prose is not entirely of the religious kind, because so far, whenever we have spoken about serious prose, apart from the satires and the things that I just mentioned, everything else borders on the religious. The moment we talk about the philosophical, we rarely talk about the secular. And Bacon is taking us to this true Renaissance idea, the true Renaissance space in which such secular discussion is possible. And if you think about it, his Advancement of Learning is a brilliant book. It is probably it would not be wrong to call it the first significant book in as far as English philosophy is concerned, because what we have here is the beginning of English secular philosophy. I don't really want to talk about Bacon because you all know a lot about Bacon. Anybody who has who has dealt with English honors knows about Bacon. And of course, Shukanta Chaudhury's wonderful book is there. But once again, his Wisdom of the Ancients is the other book that one has to mention. This Wisdom of the Ancients, in which he is dealing with this kind of tradition, the kind of continuity, of course Eurocentric, definitely, but they were not conscious of any other land. And this is a criticism, perhaps a colonial criticism, which we cannot avoid, that even though they were discovering other lands, they were not discovering other wisdoms. The Renaissance remains an European Renaissance. The Renaissance is not open to other cultural artifacts, other cultural texts. They were, of course, it's wrong to blame the Renaissance for that, because these new cultures are so new. And of course, in India, we feel that when the English are coming to India around this time, when Donne is talking about the Ganges and how he will find rubies on the banks of the Ganges, it feels a little it feels that it's a little unfair because they are not open to the century-old wisdoms that these colonies, the later colonies, these new lands could offer them. But anyway, what we have here is of remarkable significance because we have a true scientific look not only at philosophy but at tradition, but at the continuity of how to accept the discovery of the ancient texts. That scientific thought, when I say scientific, I mean clarity of thought, I mean clear and perfect categorization. And his first version of essays, which is called Essays, Religious Meditations, Places of Persuasion and Dissuasion, although religious meditations, but when you read those essays, you see that these are wonderfully, I mean, I know you have all read these essays. I don't have to give you an eulogy for these, give you a kind of worshipping of these essays or something like that. And the enlarged versions of the essays, of course, is coming in 1625, Essays or Counsels, Civil and Moral. What I find very interesting is the difference between these two titles. The first version is Religious Meditations, Places of Persuasion and Dissuasions, Seen and Allowed. The second one is, the third one, I'm sorry, is called Essays or Counsels, Civil and Moral, and the secular idea, the non-religious flavor is seeping in. This is the Renaissance thinker who is writing, the humanist thinker who is writing, whose judgment is not entirely clouded by the religious background. And one has to mention the New Atlantis. It was Bacon's utopia, as people call it. Bacon's utopia. And he is conceiving the idea of a scientific establishment which would look at the world through the eye of the researcher. What we have is, in Bacon, we find the first true systematic exploration of human knowledge and a consciously scientific look at history. And the prose that we are looking at is a prose which is logical, rational, which has now formed into the English prose that we know, not like the earlier prose that I have been describing, the development, the evolution that I have been describing, not only concerned with immediate life or the afterlife, but concerned with a kind of rationality, concerned with what we expect from the Renaissance, the secular, humanist, rational point of view. And it's a long road that we are traversing, not temporally, perhaps it's not long. We are starting, it's a matter of, say, 2 decades or 3 decades, or perhaps even 4 decades, which is not very long if we think about the entire history of English literature. But in this span of time, we have the establishment of Renaissance prose. Now, I would conclude, I have been talking for a long time, I would like to conclude. Look, Elizabethan prose presents the story of experimentation with a new form. The experiments with drama were more spectacular, but prose also managed to make the necessary inroads, even without the advantage of courtly patronage that drama received. It was a time when we not only have the tracts and fictional romances, but also significant texts like Walter Raleigh's Discovery of Guyana and the History of the World. Drama, with its spectacles, was naturally popular, but the reading public was quite happy with the new avenues explored in the form of prose. In fact, prose fiction was relatively new, evolving and perfecting itself, and had stiff competition from the prevailing poetic and romance forms. The unallegorical focus on the ordinary was striking, and that alone set it apart, even though the narrative style was simple. The non-fiction found perfection in the hands of Bacon and the others. Fiction would soon develop into the English novel as we know it, and the essays would find itself perfected in the hands of Addison and Steele. And you know, what I would end with is this opening up of the vista for fiction, which would actually create the development of popular prose. And along with, I mean, when we look at the Renaissance prose, when we look at Elizabethan prose, we tend to think that we are leading towards only non-fiction and the essays and the tracts and etc. But the focus on fiction is equally significant, and it should be looked at as the history that leads us to the novel as well. Thank you. I will stop the presentation now. Over to you. Thank you so much for listening to me for such a long time.
They have a mic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siddharth. This was definitely a very enriching one. And usually we have seen that whenever we talk about Elizabethan age, poetry and drama, they become the star of the age, and prose usually takes the back seat. But you have given so much information regarding this genre that I'm sure that students must be eager to know more, and they will go back to their textbooks and they would like to understand Green and Nash and Devaney in a better way. Let me also say that this has been the most pictorial presentation so far. You have taken a lot of pain in taking out all the pictures of the text, and that has given us the very much idea of that. So thank you so much, and I'm sure students have different questions and queries regarding this, and we are just waiting for their observations and comments and questions so that we can ask you. Students, if you have any query, just put it in chat box.
Can I make a request?
Yeah.
Because of my health conditions, can we have like 5 questions, and
Sure.
rest you have my email ID. All the students can have my email ID, and they can send their questions.
Sure, sir.
I
Sure.
can,
We'll take even less than that, hopefully. Yes.
It's all up to you. If you are not feeling well, we can just conclude right here, and we can send you questions later on.
I got that question from Alia, and how
Alia.
it's influencing the modern prose. And you see, Alia, what we have here is the first, as I said, rational and unclouded idea. That is the gift that the Renaissance is giving to the artistic sphere, that it is thinking beyond any kind of religious coloring, and it is starting with Chaucer, of course. It is starting with Chaucer and a few other writers. I mean, we cannot really categorize things like that. We cannot really, literature cannot be bound in terms. We do that for our convenience. But the Renaissance prose, if you look at it, it is, many people call it modern prose, because the modernity that we celebrate now, the clarity of thought, the secular ideas, and of course the idea of challenging what is there in authority, that is actually starting with the Renaissance and that prose. And we are thankfully carrying on with that tradition. We are still able to carry on with that tradition. So in a way, there is no other modern prose, but we are still continuing from the Renaissance bit. It's still that fashion, still that style. The language, of course, has changed. The concerns have changed. But essentially, English prose has this shape from the Renaissance, and it has continued with that shape. It has become more personal with Addison and Steele. It has become more technical, theoretical, perhaps later on in the postmodern space. But generally, we are carrying on that same tradition still. Thank you for your question, Alia.
Yeah, there is one more question. Rajshri is there.
So this is a question from Rashri. What possibly could have led to the shift towards prose writing from poetry and drama? Since the age was so dominant by drama and poetry, did it represent artistic incompetency in any manner at that time?
Right. And this is, of course, a very important question, because I should have clarified this a bit more. Thank you for this question. Because, see, drama was absolutely the thing at that time. It was like cinema of that time. So people would be going to theaters and everything, and they, I mean, you know how popular theater was. All classes of society, they would be going to the theater. But theater was rare. If you think about those theater houses, you know, the Globe or the Rose, they were open air, because artificial lighting wasn't invented then, electricity wasn't there, and they did not have a safe method of using fire inside, because fire was a huge hazard at that time. If you remember your history of England, London had been ravaged by fire repeatedly at that time. So theater was not a lot. Theater would happen only in certain seasons, when there was not much rain. And when we are talking about England, England has rain all the time. So theater, although it was very popular, still it was not as available as we might think. But the theatrical texts were available in print. But I don't know about you, but many of my students tell me that reading theater is not as easy as reading other prose, because you have to create that theater in your mind. You have to think about the characters, the personas, the different people who are speaking. Prose has the luxury of describing them for you. So a lot of my students do not like to read theater unless they are forced to. I mean, in the syllabus we have a lot of theater and we are forced to read that. But we do that in a classroom where we have discussions and multiple points of view can be. But generally, people are not fond of reading theater. Theater books, drama books, even the most popular theater books do not sell that much. They sell only as, you know, to the people who are fond of theater. But the other prose works they sell. The competition here is between prose and poetry, because poetry sells a lot. Poetry sold a lot. It does not sell anymore, unfortunately. But and you know, the only two texts of Shakespeare which are officially Shakespeare's are the two poems, The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis, I think. These two poems are the ones which sold a lot, which earned him a lot of money. So people were reading poetry a lot, the ballads and everything, the sonnet sequences. And the prose, of course, was beginning. And it was not as popular as you might think, or as my presentation may have implied, but it was gaining in popularity. People were slowly shifting towards prose as well. It was not overshadowing poetry. Poetry was still immensely popular. The romances were immensely popular. But prose was beginning to be popular at this point of time. With the novel and with Addison and Steele, with those essays, it would become very popular. I mean, if you have read Bacon, you would see that Bacon would not be tremendously entertaining. So the amusement bit needed to come in, and that would be a later development. Prose would become popular, that popular, a little later. So I hope it answers your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I think there was another question which shifted very quickly before I could read it.
This was observation and admiration for your lecture. I don't see any question.
Yes, there is no question on now. So, Mohammed, हम लोग आगे बढ़ें. We can go ahead.
Sir, so we are thankful again, but we need to thank you, formally, and to give a word of thanks, I would like to invite Dasar, who is the senior most one in our department, to express and our gratitude to it.
Thank you, Neha. Audible to you, Neha ma'am? Am I audible? Am I audible to you?
Yes, sir, but your voice is cracking. If you can like shift a little bit.
Okay. It has been a very rewarding experience to hear Dr. Swas on Renaissance. You have very insightfully delved deep into the nuances of the subject and have also discussed threadbare its different ramifications. Although the subject is very vast, you have covered it so concisely, yet so impactful. Your highly enriching and captivating deliberations have certainly enhanced our understanding of the subject, more so of our students. So I, on behalf of the Department of English, Karim City College, thank you very much for being with us this evening and for such a wonderful lecture that you have delivered. You have also addressed the queries of our students so analytically that they have been fully satisfied, and when they go back to their book, they will again try to relate it with their textbooks and the books of history of English literature. Thank you once again, sir. And I also take this opportunity to thank all the participants and the wonderful audience that we have with us this evening. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I would also like to thank the students who have been wonderful and all. It was wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you so
sir.
much.
Thank you, sir. And take care, sir.
My
Take care.
thoughts you have
And
managed
you
to.
take care too. We still are in very troubled times. So
Yeah,
I
certainly.
hope all of you remain healthy and do stay safe.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much. And our sincere wishes for this
Thank
full
you.
recovery.
Thank you.
थैंक यू सब लोगों का जो बच गए हैं.
Thank you, sir.
थैंक यू. आज ऑडियो गड़बड़ था कई लोगों का.
हाँ.
बीच बीच में डिस्टर्ब हो रहा है।
हाँ, दास सर का भी गड़बड़ था, नेहा मैम का भी बीच बीच में क्रैक कर रहा था, लेकिन कम कर रहा था। दास सर का बहुत गड़बड़ थी।
नेटवर्क प्रॉब्लम है लगा।
नहीं सर, वो उस दिन जो हम लोगों ने आपसे माइक लगवाया था ना, वही लगाया कीजिए, वो सही रहेगा, वो जो हेडफोन।
हाँ, और वर्चुअल में तो आवाज बड़ी इंपॉर्टेंट हो जाती है, मतलब अगर वो क्रैक कर रही है तो सब बेकार हो जाता है।
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल।
बासु, घर पे सब ठीक है?
बासु, हम लोग पूछ रहे हैं कि घर पे सब ठीक है?
हाँ, घर पे ठीक ही है। कल हम भी जा रहे हैं वैक्सीन लेने, मेरा
हाँ,
भी
ले लो।
शेड्यूल हो पाया फाइनली।
फर्स्ट
बाकी लोगों को तो 3 महीना बाद लेना है।
हाँ।
हम ले आते हैं।
हाँ,
हालांकि क्या पता, हमको भी हुआ ही रहा होगा। इतने लोगों को हुआ तो हमको नहीं हुआ होगा क्या?
नहीं तो तुम्हारा टेस्ट तो दोनों बार नेगेटिव आया था
हाँ,
ना?
टेस्ट तो नेगेटिव आया, इसीलिए जाकर ले लेते हैं, जो होगा देखा जाएगा।
हाँ, नहीं बिल्कुल, भगवान का नाम लो और
हालांकि
जाओ।
उत्तम तो कह रहे हैं कि तुमको तो हुआ ही होगा, तुमको कुछ हो जाएगा, तुमको शुगर है। हमारे सब जो होगा देखा जाएगा, जो होगा तो होगा।
नहीं, ऐसा ऐसा कुछ नहीं है। वो मना इसलिए करते हैं, मेरा ख्याल है कि आपके ऑलरेडी एंटीबॉडी डेवलप्ड है, और कोई रीजन
हाँ
नहीं।
हाँ,
सही है, सही है।
चलो
ले
ठीक ही है। संडे तो नहीं है ना?
नहीं, संडे नहीं है।
ठीक है, कल है
ब्रेक है।
बस।
चलो,
हाँ, कल है, उसके बाद फिर संडे थोड़ा हम लोग आराम करेंगे।
ठीक, ओके,
बाय बाय।
बाय
बाय बाय बाय, गुड नाइट,
बाय
टेक केयर।
साकेत।
बाय मैम।
चलो साकेत, एक बार बात कर लेना रियाज ये इनसे।
हाँ सर, बहुत लगातार कॉल्स पे कॉल्स आ रहे हैं।
और होगा, और भी आया है क्या?
हाँ, मतलब सर 150 में 35 रिजल्ट आएगा तो क्या होगा?
150 में सिर्फ 35 पास हुए हैं?
मतलब 35 रिजल्ट ही आया सर, बाकी स्टूडेंट्स का तो कुछ है ही नहीं, रोल नंबर वगैरह कुछ भी।
ये क्या बात है?
हाँ सर, ओनली 35 स्टूडेंट्स।
ऐसा कैसे हो सकता है? हम क्या समझ रहे हैं कि सिर्फ 35 लोगों का इशू है।
नहीं सर, 35 का आया है इंक्लूडिंग पास एंड प्रमोट दोनों, टोटल 35 का ही रोल नंबर है।
ऐसा कैसे
5
है?
प्रमोट में 30, हाँ 30 पास में 5 प्रमोट में।
बाकी सब फेल कर गए?
नाम ही नहीं है।
ये क्या बात है?
और त्रिपाठी सर सही बोल रहे हैं सर, त्रिपाठी सर सही बोल रहे हैं, वो जी का कुछ इश्यूज होगा किसी ना किसी का।
रियाज सर से बात करें क्या, या वेट करें?
पहला तो ये जरूर सर, ये तो बात पहुंचानी जरूरी है। 150 में 35 की, मतलब हम लोग 150 लेके चले सर अपना टोटल, तो 35 सिर्फ कैसे आएगा? और जो 5 भी हैं उसमें हमारे अच्छे स्टूडेंट्स हैं जो पता नहीं कैसे प्रमोशन में उसमें है ऐसे स्टूडेंट्स।
अच्छा,
डिपार्टमेंट में सर अच्छे स्टूडेंट्स कहीं सर प्रमोशन में आ जाएगा तो क्या कैसे चलेगा?
रियाज सर से बात करके देखते हैं।
हाँ सर।
अभी करते हैं, रुको।
हाँ सर।
बिजी बता रहा है। और ये जैनब, अच्छा जैनब वगैरह का तो अभी फाइनल ये राउंड में बचा। भाई हम लोगों ने अगर खराब मार्क्स दिया है तो इतने लोगों को थोड़ी खराब मार्क्स दिया है कि 150 लोग में
नहीं
से
सर, नहीं सर,
120 लोग फेल कर जाएंगे।
सर श्योर है सर, इसमें हमारा ऑनर्स वालों का कोई इशू ही नहीं है, कुछ और इशू है सर। अब या तो वहां से टेक्निकल फॉल्ट है या किसी जी का फॉल्ट है, लेकिन हमारा या हमारे स्टूडेंट्स का कोई फॉल्ट नहीं है सर। हाँ, कोई होगा जो सिम्बर में खराबी करके आया होगा, एक आध, उसमें तो नहीं पता, लेकिन 5 का 5 में सब खराब नहीं है सर, जो जिसका प्रमोशन है।
तो चले हम लोग, रियाज सर से बात होगी तो हम बताएंगे।
हाँ सर, हाँ सर, ठीक है सर। बाय सर।
बाय सर।